Mountain bikes these days are loaded with tech to make riding a better experience. Things like electronic gears, clutch derailleurs, complicated suspension kinematics, even self-adjusting suspension is available. Now, it could be easy to think all of this stuff is brand new, we've never seen it before. However, a lot of these things we have seen in some guise or other in the past. So today, we're going to check out some of the latest and greatest tech and have a little look at where it all came from. Okay, so let's start with automatic suspension adjustment. Now, bearing in mind, when suspension first happened on mountain bikes, you were talking just a fork on the front with about 45mm of travel. And people said that was too much, which is crazy to think where we are today. A bike with less than 130mm travel front and rear could be considered short travel. And it's possible now with tech to ride bikes with up to 180mm travel uphill all day long. However, electronic suspension that self-adjusts is just the absolute peak of development, and that's where we are with Fox Live Valve and RockShox's Flight Attendant, two same but different style systems. Now, Fox Live Valve is a wired system, it has a wiring loom in the bike and a bunch of different accelerometers and sensors. The RockShox's Flight Attendant system is a wireless system, but it too also has a bunch of different cadence sensors, accelerometers and things built into the bike. Now, the fundamental difference between the two is the Live Valve system by Fox. It's actually on the firmer setting by default, and it unlocks or opens up as it starts sensing the bumps. And the RockShox system is the opposite. Now, because of the fact that the Fox system has a wiring loom built in, it reacts in just 3 milliseconds. So that is making a decision and acting on it. Whereas the RockShox system is 5 milliseconds, but still, they're both incredible in different kind of ways. But this has kind of been approached before. Now, skip back to the 90s when suspension was just happening. One of the earliest bikes you could get was the off-road ProFlex. Had a flex stem on the front and actually kind of lame rear suspension. That company was later bought by K2, who started stepping things up, and they released the SmartShock in 1997. Here's a little look at it. This is an old catalogue I've got, and I mean, I think the thing looks really cool actually. It's a unit that sits on a shock and it has a piezoelectric valve on the inside, which can make decisions, they say, 1,000 times a second. Which is staggering really if you consider how old this thing is. Now, I'm actually unaware of how well it works because I never got to try one or even meet anyone that had one on a bike. So if you have actually used one of these SmartShock systems, please let us know in the comments below, and if you still got it and we can have a look at it, even better so. But the fact is, it was a battery-powered system with a piezoelectric valve that could adjust the oil flow into the shock. Now, you could argue, perhaps if the shock absorber systems were better back then, this might have been a system we saw more of, but kind of disappeared over time. And in 2012, RockShox dangled the carrot with a bit of a taste of the future here. We actually saw this on Lapierre bikes, but it was available on Ghost and High Bike as well. Now, it's a RockShox shock, and it had a tiny little servo on the top of the shock there. You can just about see it in this picture. It had a wiring loom that would be on the inside of the bike with the battery mounted on the down tube. You'd have a cadence sensor in the bottom bracket so it would know when you're pedaling, so it can add compression, or when you're coasting and it could remove it or open it completely. You'd have sensors on the fork. And the idea was that the fork would move for an impact and it would make a decision, judging by how fast you're traveling via GPS, of how much compression it needed to add to the rear shock. They said it could act in 1/10 of a second, which was roughly the time it would take for an impact from the front wheel to hit the rear wheel at 36 kilometers per hour. 1/10 of a second, pretty impressive stuff. Got to say, it rode really well. I loved riding it, but I've got to say, not a patch on what Flight Attendant and Live Valve can do. They really are the uppermost end of where tech is today. Next up, electronic gears. Yeah, so the big brands out there, Shimano and SRAM, both have equivalents. And actually, in a sort of weird way, it's always seemed puzzling to me that we have electronics on bikes that are designed to ride in dirt and mud and rain and stuff, but hey, there's two excellent systems out there that are ultra fast and accurate, and there's loads of different options with tuning with apps. So Shimano, of course, have Di2, which we actually saw very early on in the road world. We're talking like the early 2000s, before it finally made it to off-road in 2014. And then, of course, there's the SRAM Access system, which again, we saw that come from the road world with the red system in around 2015, and then on 2017, we started seeing the prototypes in the mountain bike world. Both Both systems are incredible. The Shimano system using wires, whereas the SRAM system, like the rest of the Access sort of ecosystem, is a wireless system. However, in 1992, Mavic, the French iconic wheel company, you'll have seen their yellow logo everywhere in the Tour de France, I'm sure, over the years, they had the ZAP system. And it was actually used in 1997 by Chris Boardman to win the TT at the opening part of the Tour de France. Now, you've got to think about road cycling and the fact that the bikes are actually fairly similar, and any advantage that can be had is an advantage in racing. So we're talking marginal gains. And if you can shift faster and more accurately than the riders around you in the peloton, it's got to be a good thing, which is why riders started taking it on. But then in 1994, Sachs released their version called Speedtronic, and of course Mavic had the second version of theirs that came to the market, but actually it was plagued by inaccuracies and it just was never that good. So unfortunately that tech didn't go any further, but nevertheless in 2001, Di2 started getting to the trekking and touring market, and of course it was a matter of time before we were going to see it on our fat off-road tired bikes. Now today we're very close to seeing production of the latest Di2 technology on regular mountain bikes, and of course the new version of SRAM Access, which we have seen prototypes around the internet. So anytime now, hopefully we're going to be riding those. I can't wait. Okay, chain tensioners are next. Now if you cast your mind back to when chain rings were plenty and there was an abundance of chain as well, we used to drop the chain all the time, which was a pain in the arse, and of course that could ruin your chances of getting a good race result as well, especially in the downhill terms where you really needed to pedal hard to get a good race result. Nowadays, thankfully, we have narrow wide chain rings, which are great because you pretty much never lose a chain, and you have a clutch to maintain the tension on it, which not only keeps the chain on, but keeps things nice and quiet. So Shimano released a clutch first in terms of the derailleur based clutch, and that came in 2011 at the XTR level. And then SRAM released theirs in 2012. That had a non-adjustable clutch, whereas the Shimano one, you could turn it on or off. Of course, you'd want to turn it off to remove your rear wheel from the bike, so you don't have to fight it. The SRAM one had a different system, it had the cage lock on there, so you could lock the lower cage. A different solution, both of them very, very good. So the tech really started back in the early 90s when you would take your mountain bike, it was just a single bike and you could race downhill, cross country, whatever. And because of those multiple chain rings and stuff, you're gonna lose a chain at some point. And the racer, in fact, the racer to bring the first medal from World Championships to the UK, a guy called Dave Hemming, in 1993, he was fed up of losing his chain. So he actually designed a chain guide in combination with a guy called Pete Tompkins from Crud Products. Now Pete gave us the first ever mountain bike mudguard. I've got one floating around behind me there somewhere. And he designed this, it fitted on the chainstay of the bike, had a Delrin, which is kind of like a Teflon style plastic nylon roller, friction coefficient device apparently, to help the chain slide over it, but more importantly it gave more chain wrap on the chain rings to stop basically dropping the chain. Great piece of kit. But it still didn't stop the fact your chain was going to be flapping around all over the place. So it was a good solution for the short term. Bullet Brothers then gave us the hypertension system. It was an aluminium arm that used to fit under your quick release axle there, and you'd have a choice of two different springs to basically put tension directly on the lower jockey cage. Now this system was brilliant at making the bike nice and silent and keeping the chain on. The problem with it was you basically had the choice of two springs, cross-country or downhill. Cross-country one was quite weak and the downhill one was so strong you had to fight it in order to change gear, so it wasn't really an ideal system. Nonetheless, it worked very well. But then, as time started moving on, we started looking at actual chain guides as well, a way of stopping the chain from even coming off the chain ring in the first place. And the king of these was the MRP Ultra Speed that we saw in the mid-90s, I think 96, when it first came out. Alloy Boomerang had two orange wheels and it had a sandwich basically system, two plates that went around the chain ring, and the chain was on the inside of there, basically the wheels would stop it jumping out. Completely silent in operation, it got around the chain slap problem. Brilliant system, and of course loads of people copied the design afterwards. Very, very cool. However, it was heavy. So in 2008, when MRP released this cyclocross 1x chain guide, mountain bikers' ears started perking up a bit, because we really did want to sort of abandon chain rings at that point, but there wasn't really a suitable way of doing it. This was a super neat plastic or nylon upper guide there, and it meant you could basically just lose some chain rings and lose a load of weight at the same time, because you're taking off chain rings, a front mech, cables, shifter. Reduce weight, basically simplify your bike, shorten the chain as well. great system, but you would still lose the chain from the bottom, which is why it was so good, and it really did change everything. When that narrow wide chainring first came in from SRAM with the X-Sync chainring and their clutch derailleur system, because that really did change everything. Death to the front derailleur. High pivot bikes. Yeah, they're all the rage, especially in downhill at the moment, and of course we have seen some bikes in the enduro world. Now, why all the fuss about them? Well, the cool thing about having a high pivot is basically it enables the rear wheel to move backwards and around that obstacle. Ultimately, if you're riding really fast, it's the square edge hits that really slow you down. So enabling the rear wheel to move up and around them, it's a no-brainer. The problem that you have with that is your chainstay effectively grows to allow that rear wheel to move up and around. As that happens, you suffer a phenomenon known as pedal kickback. As that chainstay extends, basically it pulls your pedals back, so you feel it. It's a horrible experience, and also as you're fighting that, it can sort of stiffen up that rear suspension. So there's a number of things there that are kind of fighting themselves. Suspension designers have got around this though by putting an idler wheel up near the height of that main pivot point and routing the chain around it. The effect of that is the bike performs a bit more like a low pivot bike in terms of the chainstay length, but it has the benefits of having a high pivot system. Brilliant stuff, but we have seen this before with a slightly different outcome actually of what was intended. Now back in 1991, Cannondale released one of the very first suspension bikes, the SE2000. Now this had an extremely high pivot, you can see it in these shots here, but notice that it doesn't have the chain routing around that main pivot there. Now you've got to take yourself back to a time when suspension was frowned upon completely because people thought it was unnecessary and really inefficient because you wanted to just pedal and that basically to take you into full propulsion. Anything that could be lost in the suspension was kind of just deemed as unnecessary. So what Cannondale did was put the pivot up really high, which kind of gave you a maximum amount of anti-squat. Now, 100% anti-squat is kind of a desirable place to get because it effectively means everything cancels itself out, so your pedaling is neutral and whatever's going on with the chain tension will not affect the rear suspension. This had probably 150, maybe even 200%. I don't even know the number it had, but it had so much anti-squat that when you pedaled, basically the chain tension would extend that suspension. So it basically would lock it out and it wouldn't bob up and down. So this was great if you wanted to just pedal in a straight line and not lose any sort of energy into that suspension. I mean, it would still bob upwards slightly. The downside it had is it made the suspension action very harsh. It wasn't exactly efficient in terms of suspension performance, but hey, it was one approach. Moving on though, two other brands, Brooklyn Machine Works and Balfour, identified two very different ways of having an efficient approach to making the high pivot system work. Now, BMW or Brooklyn Machine Works first surfaced in the late 90s, so 97, 98, you started to see prototype bikes from them. Now, what they used to do to get around it was actually, instead of having an idler wheel, the right chainring would actually be around the pivot itself. So the chain line would be completely constant. So the chain length would not change as the suspension moves at all. So effectively you could have them single speed, which actually in a roundabout way is what modern brand Tourer have done. They've re-released something very similar to these. There's going to be some images on screen so you can see for reference there. But the way they got around this, because you couldn't obviously just pedal the bike with the chainring that high, was to have a left-hand drive system. So it had a jack shaft to connect. So essentially the bike had a left-hand chainring that was connected to an idler wheel that actually gave constant chain length. Very cool system, and it worked really, really well. Next up was Balfour in the late 90s. Now they had various different iterations of the bikes, including the BB7 you can see here, which was slightly later, but a revised version. So it's got a linkage on the back end, so it's got a very intelligent suspension system, and as you can see, it's got an idler wheel. So this is one of the earliest versions of bikes that had an idler wheel system in there to tame that suspension. Very cool stuff, and I'm pleased to say they would definitely look at the future because we're seeing this exact technology being used again. It's important just to acknowledge that all the bikes and all the tech we have today, it is incredible and it is much better than anything we've had before. But it had to start somewhere. And I love looking back at stuff. And I'd love to know if there's any modern tech that you think has been done before that we've missed out here. Let us know in the comments underneath. And what was your favourite or most obscure piece of tech we talked about in this video today? Let us know in the comments below, and please do see you soon in another video. Take care.